Well, thanks, Allison. And it is 11, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started, and people can trickle in or access the recording if they trickle in late. So hi, everyone, and welcome to today's panel. My name is Alyssa, and the topic we'll be discussing today is remote user research. So I'm really excited to be discussing this topic. We are clearly exploring some new territory with the current pandemic, and the shift to working remotely means that research is also transitioning to remote methods. So this is clearly a very relevant topic, and there's a lot to discuss and learn today with our very knowledgeable and experienced group of panelists. So before we dive in, I want to say thank you to Techstars, Honey, Name.com, Downtown Boulder Partnership, and CU for their sponsorship of Boulder Startup Week. Without them, this wouldn't be possible. Okay. So now I'm pleased to present our guests for today. We have an incredibly talented group of individuals joining us to weigh in on the topic of remote research. So I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves momentarily, but first I want to cover some housekeeping items. So the first thing is we will dedicate some time at the end for Q&A. So I welcome and encourage you to ask questions. If you're logged into the Zoom webinar, you'll see that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can click that to submit your questions. And then at the end, we'll try to address as many as we can with the time that we have. Additionally, you should have received a poll question about your experience in UX. This is just so that we can understand who's in the audience. So if you haven't already answered that, please go ahead and do so, and then we will come back to that later. So without further ado, I'll hand it off to Molly to start the introductions.
Sure, thanks so much. I am so excited to be here today. I'm excited to learn from everyone on the panel and everyone who's attended. I'm excited. So my name is Molly Rempe. I'm a senior UX researcher at Answer Lab. I hold a master's of science in applied anthropology, and I've been working in the UXR industry for about 6 years now. My experience in remote research began in a hardware-centric company. So because we were so focused on physical things, mostly our remote research had to do with kind of surveys and some supplementary phone calls. Then I transitioned to a research position within an innovation hub. And at that position, we were really trying to answer some sweeping industry questions in like the fuzzy front end of development. So like, what does the transportation industry struggle with? What does healthcare struggle with? What about the home insurance industry? So because it was so broad and our target populations were often too busy to meet in person, it felt natural to leverage remote interviewing techniques. So I did that for about 2 years pretty heavily. And then this January, I actually transitioned pre-COVID to a full-time remote researcher role in a wonderful research consultancy called Answer Lab. So although I've conducted a few studies in person, really, I spend most of my time doing rapid remote research in week-long sprints. And I rely heavily on screen share technology and digital prototypes. So that's me. I'll pop it over to Michael.
Thanks, Molly. Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Bamberger. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Tetra Insights. We're a research technology company based here in Boulder. We provide software and services to support user research practices across organizations. And for about a decade, I've been working primarily with enterprise companies to help them understand their users to make better product decisions. Over 90% of the qualitative research work I've been involved with has been remote. So I'm looking forward to hopefully sharing some hard-earned lessons that my team has gone through and experiencing a lot of pain doing qualitative research at scale with you all here today. And I'll hand it over to Tamara.
Hey everyone, I'm Tamara Hale. My pronouns are she, her, and they, them. I am a research strategy manager at Workday. Workday is a financial management and human capital management software company. We are definitely not startup size anymore. We are pretty large. We have a research practice of about 35 research specialists that I lead, and then I also run a central insights and strategy team within that. Been doing this kind of research for, I don't know, probably like 15 years or something like that. My background is in cultural anthropology. I'm a recovering academic. So my default preferred research method is very much in-person ethnography, going deep. But I've been in the remote game probably ever since I sort of joined the world of UX, I don't know, something like 7 years ago. And right now, I would say, even before the pandemic, probably about 50% of our studies were already remote. And we'll talk later about what those looked like. And obviously right now we are running all of our studies remotely and adapting our processes to accommodate for that and to continue to deliver the kinds of insights we need to put out there to shape the product strategy and roadmap. And I'm so excited to be here. I love connecting with local researchers, although it sounds like we've got some people from all over the place. So this is super exciting. And I'm gonna hand it over to Shannon.
Hi everyone, I'm delighted to be here as well. This is a obviously really timely topic, and it's just going to be a lot of fun to discuss this with all of you and learn from you. So I'm Shannon Hallgren. I am the president and senior UX consultant at Sage Research and Design. We're a consultancy located here in Boulder, Colorado. One of our big specialties is user experience research. We do a wide variety of different techniques, both qualitative and quantitative. So we do things like usability testing, online surveys, contextual inquiry, journey mapping, all that good stuff. Another big part of our business is healthcare human factors. Specifically, we help our clients get their medical devices through the FDA human factors submission process. In terms of remote experience, like Tamara, about half of our research, even pre-COVID, is done remotely. So it's something that we are very familiar with and do all the time. Some of our current projects, like right now that we're doing remote work for our clients, include our clients that we're doing remote work for include Google, Indeed, SolarWinds, and several others. So I look forward to this conversation.
Great. Well, thank you all for that. And I'm excited to dig in with such an experienced group of individuals. I think we have a lot to learn from you. But before we dive in, let's take a look at the poll results just to see who we have in the audience today. Oh, great. So it looks like we do have quite a range from, completely new to experienced and experienced but still learning. So that's wonderful. Welcome. Okay, so now let's dive into the topic of today, remote research. I want to start by talking about what remote research looks like. So can you share a few examples of research studies that you've conducted remotely?
Sure, I can start out. So as a consultancy, we see a really wide variety of different projects, which is one of the things I love about consulting. And as I mentioned, we have a couple current remote ones going on right now. So I thought I just shared a very high level what we're doing for a couple different clients. One of them is, I'll call it kind of a combined UX and marketing study. Sometimes those two go hand in hand really well, especially when it comes to remote research. So one of our current projects, a product manager came to us and they wanted to learn a lot more about one of their new target personas. They just wanted to learn about this user group, what their current roles and responsibilities are within their company, what their needs and pain points are, what tools are they currently using, and how well are those tools supporting their roles and their jobs. And so we're interviewing 12 folks from this target profile, and we're just interviewing them, having a conversation about what their jobs are, how they do certain processes. And also along with that, we're validating certain use cases that the product team had already come up with. So, we present them with a typical workflow or pain point and have them tell us how high a need is this to you, how high a priority or pain point is it, and sort of getting that data along with the context that comes from the in-depth interview. So that's one that's just, again, really adapts well to remote research. Another one we're currently doing is with a really established company that has a really great UX process in place, and we're doing iterative testing for them. So we have a cadence of every 2 weeks, we're doing iterative testing where we're inviting in 5 to 6 users who match their target market. And what we're testing are just designs that are in process. So there are several different designs teams in this company, and the designers can sign up to have a piece of these iterative sessions. And so we'll meet with the designers, learn what they want to learn, get introduced to the prototypes that they've created for our sessions. And then our sessions are just a mix of, okay, here's designer A's designs that we're going to walk through and do a few workflows through. And here's designer B's, a few screens for them that we want to get your feedback on. It's a really wonderful process. And just by doing it every 2 weeks, we are constantly getting data to the product teams, and they're able to move really quickly and fast. So in a nutshell, that's some of what we do. Love to hear about the others.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about some of our studies. So we do a lot of similar things to what you were talking about, Shannon, helping companies to test prototypes and new product concepts. I'd say the majority of user research we do remotely is on product concept validation or refining interfaces of products. And that seems to work well for us for research. We can do a lot of framing for our participants through surveys up front. It also gives us some good fodder for honing our research plans when we're doing remote interviews. So getting deep into pain points, value propositions, and user experience elements that resonate in terms of existing or prototype products, I'd say that's the vast majority of the type of research we're doing remotely.
I wanted to make a plug for other types of research that we're encouraging our team to lean into as well. I think our minds can jump immediately to, like, how do we do a usability study that we would have done in a lab or in person? How do we do that remotely? We're certainly doing a whole bunch of that. But this is also a really great time to lean into types of research that are inherently very remote friendly, that could already be part of your research practice, or that you could increase your skills in. So for example, surveys, we're leaning into surveys a lot. We've been doing a lot of sort of training into secondary research. So how do you leverage academic literature in a business environment? How do you get the most out of past research studies that you've done? We're very fortunate that we now have a research archive or repository that our researchers can go back to. But there might be other things available to folks who don't have that. Things like heuristic analyses or competitive research, and tools like card sorting, which, if you're not familiar with, is a way to sort of test an information architecture, and really encouraging researchers to go back to some of the basics that maybe we don't prioritize as much when we're really focused on doing things with a person, as well as trying to figure out how we can take our usability studies and our generative interviews into a remote environment.
Excellent. I love hearing all of those examples. I will just kind of share broadly how remote research has looked like for me. In my last company, we were really doing generative research. So it really was these large industry questions. And like I said, so we were able to leverage just phone calls, really, sometimes sharing prototypes using WebEx screen share, but really just understanding pain points, behaviors, larger motivations and goals and tools that individuals are using just on a reported basis. And so that worked really well. And from that gave us almost like a hypothesis based on our small samples of 5 to 10 individuals in the industry, that we could then create a journey map of sorts that we could then go back and test either with surveys or with more in-depth studies on smaller parts of that journey. So that worked really nicely. Now, honestly, I'm kind of pendulating the other way a little bit, where I do a lot of evaluative work. So we often have a design or multiple designs we're interested in testing. And I also want to just kind of plug as well that this evaluative work often comes into which design do individuals like better, which flow is more efficient, which is more attractive, those kinds of things. But along that, we're also asking larger questions, like what's the mental model when somebody is trying to find information? Or what are the goals when somebody is looking for a new couch? It's not just to buy a new couch. There's a whole ecosystem of behaviors and motivations that kind of filter in. And so although what I've seen in the last few months is that we're penduluming a little bit to the evaluative side of things, you can still answer those larger research questions about your users by sprinkling in more generative approaches there.
That's great. Thanks for sharing. So now I want to move on and talk about advantages and disadvantages of remote research. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of conducting remote research? And are there cases where it would be more advantageous to conduct research in person?
Yeah, I'll kick this one off. A couple of thoughts on that. There are definitely, I think, instances where remote research is hugely beneficial over other types of research. And I'm going to talk about sort of person-to-person research, not the other examples that I gave of remote research or research methods that are inherently remote friendly. So, so talking about remote usability and remote, generative studies, I think the obvious benefits are when geographical distance is a factor, time zones are a factor. It's a method that allows you to sort of overcome some of those challenges that might make it harder for you to do in-person research, right? We are doing research all over the globe right now, and it gets a lot easier if we don't have to fly out a team of researchers and designers and product managers to different parts of the globe to do that. We can do that much more easily. It can be more budget friendly. I say can because technology is the big sort of factor, recruiting as well as the big factor in that. But we're finding it to be a less expensive way to do research. Because of all of those reasons, it allows us to, in some ways, be more inclusive in our research, right? We get to tap into more different geographical regions, languages, cultural areas, also accessing a broader range of user types just because it is so sort of nimble. Can also be more accessible because we can sort of make use of when people are using technology at home to allow them to access the study in a way that works for them. And then I think the other big advantage over something that is more heavily scheduled, that it takes a lot of time to plan, is it allows us to do more sort of timely or time-aware research, right? Meeting users when they are actually doing that task that we want to observe rather than providing a prototype. I think the remote method is really helpful for that. Some disadvantages, I think, the most obvious one is obviously that personal connection. And I say personal connection, I'd say with both your users and your stakeholders, right? There's just a lot that we can gain from being in the room with someone. There's a lot you can read from the body language, the nonverbal cues that is not as obvious when you're mediated through a screen. And then there's the sort of the context, the environment. For us, a lot of what we're doing is understanding a user's workflow, and that is much more than how they just interact with Workday, our platform, right? It's understanding, we're looking at their desks, we're looking at the Post-it notes they've written to themselves, and all of that stuff, how they interact with their colleagues, all that kind of stuff is a little bit harder, I think, to get from remote research, although there are tools and solutions out there that can help with that, like diary studies. That's one that we're looking at right now. But that's a little bit more challenging. That's not to say it can't be overcome. I think you just have to be creative about how you look at those things. And then the other side of personal connection, what we're seeing is our researchers are really, great about understanding our stakeholders and bringing our stakeholders along on the journey. And that's something that they're being really creative and innovative with in terms of how we do that. We get a lot of benefit, even if we're running a usability study in a lab. There's so much going on in that observation room with people having really interesting conversations about what they're seeing live. That's a little bit more difficult for us right now to create that on Zoom is the platform we happen to use, but people are getting creative with breakout rooms and other ways of sort of bringing the stories back home to the stakeholders. Although that is, I think that's the other challenge that we don't think about as much. And then other things like information security. It's just something you have to think about how secure it is when you're using remote tools rather than maybe bringing someone in. And then, I think technology is like all, technology is not a neutral tool. It has so many affordances. It also has many issues, right? So like screen sharing, internet connections, all that stuff is coming up for us that we're, trying to overcome some of those challenges. And some of it honestly is a little bit unpredictable and requires a lot of flexibility on the spot. There is a ton of resources out there as well. So I just wanted to point that out, and I can post some of these in the chat. Rosenfeld put out a book a couple of years ago about remote research by Nate Bolt, and I think another co-author. I can post those in the chat that sort of talk about how to set it up and the pros and cons as well. And kick it back to the other panelists for other thoughts on this topic.
That was great. I was going through my kind of prepared list and just checking them all off. So that was wonderful. I have a few, and unfortunately they're all the cons left because there's so many pros to remote research. And so I really want to emphasize that. But there are some trade-offs that we're making. Tamara, you ended with kind of tech difficulties are real. And I'd like to add on to that is that they're kind of just a new normal, especially even with bandwidth in the US. If we just talk about that specific sector, probably 20% of my sessions don't end the way that, or don't work the way that I anticipate because of low bandwidth. So people are kicked off calls, screen share doesn't work, maybe devices aren't updated, or there's some compatibility issues. So that's just something to be kept in mind, especially during recruitment. The other thing is I have a pretty large team in India that's working on remote research in India. And that's a whole new set of realities that we're tackling. So although our team has a wonderful way of doing remote research in the US, they don't translate. And so we've had to create new formulas for how to do that effectively in India. So just kind of thinking about technology, remote research is not like a one size fits all. And I also want to kind of highlight that we're kind of self-sampling for highly technical illiterate, sometimes higher SES individuals. So we're actually potentially missing out on a large group of individuals. Even accessibility, those with lower eyesight might not be able to use the mobile devices that we're trying to test things on. And so we're actually self-selecting out of those populations and might be missing out on a lot of really important data that we just don't have access to remotely. I'd also like to say that it's harder sometimes to establish a mutually beneficial exchange. I think in research, we always want to show our participants that although they're giving us data, we're hoping that they can be involved and they're getting an equally beneficial result. Sometimes it's an incentive, sometimes it is just being involved in the design process. Sometimes it's being able to share their thoughts with somebody who actually cares. And sometimes that's hard to get across when there's a 30-minute call that you have to have a list of questions for. And finally, I want to kind of emphasize that I saw that there's a lot of newish researchers or research curious individuals. I'm really excited you're on this call. And I am concerned that sometimes when we move towards remote research, research becomes a checklist of questions that we ask individuals. And research, user research is often much more than that. It's not just getting the answers to questions, it's understanding when to probe, understanding the ecosystem around the answers, and not taking all answers at face value, but understanding both behaviors and reported data. And so it just doesn't translate always to move towards remote research when there's potentially larger questions we have to probe at. And I think that's further my final points.
I'll hop in here. I think those are all excellent points, and I agree. I'm checking mark, off all. I would have said all those same things. I think there's one important disadvantage that hasn't been covered yet, and that is remote testing doesn't always lend itself well to testing a physical device. It's great if the product you're testing is online or on a mobile app or something, but and this of course affects the side of our services in the healthcare world. So, for instance, if we were interested in usability testing the programmability of an IV pump, watching that nurse interact with it from afar, or even worse, having the nurse tell us what button to push as he or she is watching us interact with the device really loses something. And yes, we would learn some things, but we would not nearly get into the level of depth of understanding that interaction and fully testing it if we can't be there in the same room with the healthcare provider. So I think that's just important to consider. If you've got a physical device, it's a lot more challenging to test that remotely. It's not impossible, and we're starting to experiment with it in these days of COVID, but it's not the ideal.
And I have a couple, I'm same thing. I was going through my list and you all have said some perfect things that resonate with me. I think a few that I have that maybe haven't been mentioned. When you're doing in-person research, most of the clients we've worked with, those are during Monday through Friday work hours where they're running those sessions. So your population is biased to people who not only will come to your office during the workday, but take a big chunk out of their day. It's not just the hour of research, it's the hour before and after traveling. So remote research actually gives you access to people who wouldn't be willing to meet with you in person. So I think that's a huge advantage. And Molly mentioned some bias that's always going to be there. You have to be, I think, aware of that. But this is an opportunity to expand your pool from your local geography into only people who have time for $100 incentive to come to your office. Another thing that I really like about remote research that I've seen with my clients now is it forces documentation and process. You have to work asynchronously with your team. Getting that buy-in and accountability for what you're going to do, I think becomes easier when you're forced to document and share it. So it's something I think we might talk about a little bit later, but documentation and process is a requirement with remote research. So I think that's a big benefit. Two disadvantages, and these are ones that I've run into just myself with client work. Developing a relationship with research participants can be really critical to getting to some of the deeper seated issues or their real feelings. And most researchers that I talk to, you have the experience where a participant will cry or it becomes almost a therapy session. And those can be very revealing. I find with remote research, you're not getting those deeper type of truths often. And I think it's because you're not developing just that human familiarity being in the same room as someone. And another one that I think is really important, depending on the category of user that you're trying to research, sometimes they're inaccessible remotely. So I think about a client we had a few years ago who it was education products for children with learning disabilities. And facilitating that research, we had to have a parent there. We had to have a daycare person who could actually be with the child while we were researching with the parent. That I don't know how we can actually facilitate those same types of research with remote only.
That's really interesting to hear all the perspectives, and there's clearly, a lot of advantages of moving to remote. So the next topic I want to cover is perhaps relevant for those who are, just making the transition, which is how do you actually conduct remote research? What are your methods and processes?
Sure, I can lead that one. What I was thinking about for this question is maybe just telling you kind of a weekly schedule that it looks like for me. I operate on week-long sprint bases. And so it's very rapid research. I'm working with one specific client, so it's very iterative. Every week I'm working with the same client and we kind of brainstorm on how we can tackle their larger research questions in a very rapid setting. And so my goal isn't to answer anything completely, but to build an understanding over time. So my weeks are pretty consistent. On Thursday, I review the study brief with my client. What are they trying to accomplish, and what would they like to get out of next week's session? And then on Friday, I build my script. There's a lot of back and forth between my client and me, but usually it is asynchronously. So I'll kind of do a draft, send it over. They'll kind of offer comments, send it back. And the goal is just to make sure that all of the script is actually tracking back to our core research questions. On Monday, I do a dry run with a colleague. Usually my sessions are 30 minutes to 60 minutes. And so I just try to make sure that we're still answering our research questions. I'm not going over time, which is a big no-no in research generally. And that it flows nicely. It doesn't seem like a checkbox. It seems like a conversation that we're having. So really just kind of an overview of what we're trying to accomplish. And then on Tuesday and Wednesday, I conduct sessions. We schedule 8 sessions with basically 9 individuals. So if 1 or 2 drop out, we still have about 7 people in our studies. And like I said, our sessions are about 30 to 60 minutes. And then on Thursday, I build my report. I only give myself 1 day to do it. Otherwise, I would spend a long time doing my reports. And so really the goal is just to lightly qualitative code my sessions. I'm doing that on Tuesday and Wednesday nights as well. but generally just get the big nuggets of information and send them to my client by Friday. My scripts, the way that I've been doing them lately, have relied heavily on think aloud usability testing. So there's a lot of words there. Most of you probably understand, some of you might not. So usability testing can go one of two ways. One is very rigorous, kind of what are the time on task? How long does it take somebody to complete this task? How many clicks do they take? What's the fail rate? And so it's very quantitative, metric driven. And oftentimes you're not talking to the participant while they're going through their tasks. I kind of tend towards the other way, which is they're conducting a task, but they're really just telling you what they see, how they feel, and how they might improve that. And so that's really how my scripts are built. It's very little of me not, or most of it's me not talking, but it's very little of me just sitting back, and it's a lot of probing and actively listening to make sure that what they're telling me I'm perceiving correctly, and they feel heard. And so, like I said, I use qualitative coding for my data, so I avoid associating quantitative numbers because I have such small sample sizes. And what I found is that when we say words like all, most, many, several, few, or none, instead of 4 out of 8, one thing is that the findings don't come across as like 8 out of 8 participants liked this button, so we will keep it. So it becomes less concrete, but it also becomes more facilitation of storytelling. So we can actually start discussing, well, you said most participants said this, but tell me why. Tell me what were the kind of the anecdotes behind it, what were they thinking? And that leads to bigger discussions. So we talk about the why more than the how did this perform. And so those are kind of what research generally, but remote research in the last few months have looked like for me. Pretty rapid, very qualitative, and light, if you will. So that's kind of my day-to-day.
I'll give a rundown of how we think about remote research, and it's we're very process and logistics oriented because we do research for clients and for ourselves. Having well-refined processes are the only way we're able to really scale our initiatives and have predictability that we'll get the results that we want. Molly made a really important point that deluding yourself that qualitative research is quantitative data is a great way to make sure you don't learn what you're supposed to from your research. So just as a general thing, that's a great thing to keep in mind, the why. But the 4 phases we break down our research into are, first, it's the research plan. That's deciding what the research includes, what we're trying to learn, getting buy-in from the rest of the team to make sure that they're on the same page about what the research plan entails. We prepare our materials like our pre-surveys, our screeners, our scripts for the actual interview. We determine what type of technology or assets we need. Do we need a prototype, landing page, other designs, existing websites, whatever it might be. And then ultimately defining what our target participants are in a very specific way so we can then screen for them. Phase 2 is recruitment. That's getting qualified participants opted in and scheduled for our research, or if it's a pre-survey, having them go through that pre-survey experience. And once we have people opted in and scheduled, then we conduct the research. And conducting the research, there's actually a lot of nuance to it. I don't know if we'll have time, but participant experience is something that I think about a lot. It's just as important as customer experience, making sure it's positive for them. It'll actually affect your results if it's not a nice, frictionless process for your participant. And that includes signing the confidentiality waivers, the compliance forms that you require, and doing incentivizing. Making sure all of that's handled during the conducting research phase. And then phase 4 is analyzing, reporting, and sharing. And this is where you go back to collaborate with the team on the insights and findings, synthesize it into a report, and share. So that's broadly how we get through our remote research work in those 4 phases.
Nice. It occurs to me that maybe one missing piece that would be helpful for everyone to hear is sort of the logistics of how at least we run our sessions. And I'd love to hear from the other panels if they do it differently, because it is a little song and pony dance that you're doing as a moderator of remote testing. For me personally, I find it easier to actually use 2 computers. So on one computer, I have the Zoom or GoToMeeting or whatever platform we're using. There's pros and cons to all of them out there. Running, and I'm talking to the participant through that computer, and that's also the same computer where I'm displaying the product we're interested in testing. And so most of the time I'm sharing my screen and giving the participant control over the actual the product that's running on my machine. And then on a separate computer, that's where I'm taking my notes. That's where I have Slack or Hangouts open and chatting with the team throughout the session. So if they have a question they'd like to interject, I can do that. Or that's sometimes where some of the team is having their those backroom conversations in like the Slack channel or something. But yeah, I just thought it was interesting that it just takes that many computers and 3 screens at a minimum for me personally to run one well. Do the rest of you do it differently?
So for our actual sessions, we always try to have 2 people from our team participate, 1 person moderating, 1 person responsible for note taking. That's one of our best practices. And when we're doing, what we try to do a phone screen for qualitative research. And during that, we do kind of a tech try run to see what aptitude the person has with technology and whether their system can actually show our prototype or interact with what we need them to interact with. So that'll be a part of our process, as well as figuring out, do we need to allow them to take control over the mouse and keyboard on a computer? If so, we'll have a second computer that's just running the prototype. And if not, then we'll do something differently. But we try to always have 2 people on every single research session.
For me, it's so light, as I said. I would love to have a note taker, but most of the sessions we aren't able to do that. And I actually do all the things that you just said on one computer. I just have multiple screens. So I'll have one screen for notes, one screen with kind of my script and my Zoom, and then I might have another screen for kind of team chats as I'm in my sessions. So it's definitely a juggling thing.
Great. Well, thank you all for answering. It's really interesting to hear how different people and experienced researchers, can actually conduct their work. So we do only have 13 minutes left, and I want to allow time for Q&A. If you haven't already put your question in the Q&A, please do so now. And as you're entering those, I'll just pose, a quick question and then move on to Q&A. So what are some pitfalls to avoid when conducting remote research?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer this one. So I think we mentioned a lot of them up front. Just to give an anecdote of an experience I had about the difficulties with technology. We were doing research for a large financial technology company with participants all over the world. And the plan design was to have them test a mobile app prototype on their phones while recording their screens and using that as our source of data. And with people in Africa and in South America, they just didn't have the bandwidth, didn't have the technology. Our research plan just was dead on arrival. So that can be a real pitfall if what you're hoping to learn is not actually vetted with the people who have to take your test. And again, like the participant experience, there's a lot to that I think is very nuanced. And some things that are non-obvious is making sure that you frame the mindset for your participant in advance of the research. I have clients who are testing these stodgy insurance applications, for example, and just having someone jump in and start talking about insurance and how, processing a claim, that's not necessarily going to be the most natural thing for people to just smoothly start talking about. So thinking about how do you warm people up to your research experience, we do things like we send pre-surveys in advance, we share materials in advance, we try to give them a little bit of context before we get started in the actual interview. And as I mentioned, doing those phone screens is really helpful there as well. One thing, and this goes back to bias, we sort of make a decision internally that we are going to be biased towards people who are good research participants. You want people who can verbalize what they're experiencing, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, and will talk for 5+ minutes at a time. I'm sure we've all had the experience. We have a research participant. It's 2-word answers, nothing to say, nothing but dead air. You have to really prod them. Like you want them to go through a landing page and they read the headline and stop to wait for more questions. You're expecting them to spend 10 minutes, exploring what the website includes. So doing phone screens, finding people who are good at articulating what they think and feel, that's really important. And again, if your target, I mentioned this before, but if your research is targeting low-income people or non-tech savvy people or people who require accessibility assistance or devices, those are going to be really difficult to address remotely. And you might have to get creative on your research methods. I think Tamara was talking about this earlier. So for example, like a phone call can be a really good research session. If that's all you can do with your participants, that's fine. You don't need to do a screen share and capture their webcam. work within your constraints. And you can maybe have them follow up and interact with a prototype over email and then get back to you. Diary studies have become popular, I think, largely because it obviates some of those problems. Use your iPhone to record yourself using a product and experiencing it, and then just email that video to us. That's fine. You don't have to use the biggest, most expensive enterprise research tools to get research done. Just be creative and make sure you're thinking about your participant from the perspective of your participant as a much better way of doing research. And another one that's non-obvious, I think, is dead air on remote interviews. When you're in person, those things feel less awkward for some reason because you're getting the nonverbal body language and communication to know that someone's thinking or processing. It's very easy, especially because a lot of researchers are naturally empathic. So you want to fill those gaps and you want to make people feel comfortable during a call. You kind of have to get away from that and allow it to be awkward and uncomfortable. Let people take time to process and digest. And another thing is, researchers are often very good at articulating their thoughts and feelings, and we'll try to complete research participants' thoughts for them, try to help them get there. And you really have to give people that pause to process and give you back good information. And one of the biggest pitfalls is you have a research plan that just is not doable. So doing those 2 to 3 internal dry runs with your team, those can be really, really helpful.
Great, thank you. So I do want to turn it over to participant questions or audience questions, since we do have quite a few good ones. The first one I'm going to ask is from Catherine. A lot of my research has been evaluative usability testing since going remote. Do you have any recommendations on how to think outside of the box with methods when conducting remote research? I find that the work has become very monotonous and we may have tunnel vision.
Well, I'll jump in. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, please, Mara.
I don't have a really great answer other than I think this is a really great question. And, I think this is something you should be thinking about as a researcher all the time anyway. I think we can get really stuck in a rut and we default back to a certain method. I mean, I don't have them on the tip of my tongue, but there are some resources out there around like participatory design and like research games. That's something that we've leveraged. There's one that I made up that I've been able to use a couple of times. It's kind of like an icon game, and it's a quick way to like get people's sort of to map out a journey or feelings on a certain topic. It's just something that prompts someone to think in a different way or to sort of have fun and play with the prompt, and that can be a really great icebreaker. Innovation Games is a book that comes to mind that has some things around that. Game Storming is another book that has some suggestions around sort of more creative prompts. But I think this is a great question, and I think now is a great time to sort of experiment more and not just assume that the sort of question answer type thing is the only thing that we can do. It's a bit of a risk, like it could fall flat. Hopefully you're in a safe and in supportive environment where that's encouraged. And it's something that you could, with all of these games, it's something I would suggest that it's something you try out with your stakeholders first or your internal team just to see if it works.
Yeah, I love those ideas. And oftentimes I feel like usability testing in general becomes a trap because it can give you a false sense that you're moving the needle in a really meaningful direction. And usability test it's really optimizing things that you've already decided, more so than anything. And I think breaking out of that sense of where we have a design that we need to test to make sure it's usable opens up your mind to creativity and being more innovative. So one thing that I've always done with clients who are, they come to us and like, we want to usability test our product. Say like, let's do the first thing we do. Like, let's just name your top 4 competitors and let's have people look at their websites and sign up for their products and see what they say. And just taking the focus away from your product and your business and just putting it outward is a very easy way to get new ideas and to be engaging. And one of the, I think, working as an agent on behalf of other clients, it gives us the ability to be removed from the decisions that are made. But when it's your own product, it's your own team, that can be difficult. Like no one wants to find out that their product isn't good or people don't like it. That's painful information, regardless of how well you prepare yourself. So sometimes just changing the perspective to let's understand what the user thinks about other people, not us, can help to maybe break out of that rut.
And I guess I'll just add one quick thing. I think another way you can break yourself out of that rut is to train yourself not to think first of the methodology. So don't say, we're going to do a usability study. First say, what do we want to learn? Think about those research questions you have. And if you can start there and divorce that from the methodology, then that really opens the door for you being creative of how are you then going to answer those research questions. And that's always the way we start, sit down with those product teams, with your team, and figure out what do we want to learn. And then you can get creative about how you're going to learn it.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that. I think that's really wonderful. And I think it's really important to have a long-term research vision that you then trace each of your research studies back to that long-term vision. So a lot of remote is often shorter. Sometimes it's more rapid and you're getting smaller nuggets, but as long as those are culminating to a larger so what, that's extremely important in my experience.
Great, thank you. And we are getting so many wonderful questions in the chat. Next, I want to ask about, I'm seeing a few about the tools that you use for remote research. So if you could speak a little bit more about that.
I can jump in really quickly. I think one of my best practices that I would definitely encourage everyone is to select your tools wisely. There's a lot of really sexy tools out there that you can use, but it might be too large of a suite for you. It might be too expensive, or it might not actually be answering what you're hoping for. So some things to keep in mind is pricing, of course. Data rights is really important, both in terms of your client or your own IP, and then also can you get that data off of your tool server? Some tools actually keep it on theirs, and you have to access it and maintain a contract in order to get it. Also RAM usage, some tools really require a lot of RAM usage for the participant. And so depending on who you're testing with, you need to be aware of that. And then what does it look like on the participant side? Make sure to test from the participant's angle. Is it usable? Is it intuitive? Does it make you want to talk to the participant? If it's clunky and a little bit hard to use, then it can be really unfortunate. But I use GoToMeeting, Google Video Conferencing, and Lookback as my primary tools when it's just kind of screen sharing. I've had really good luck in the past with WebEx, and it's just screen sharing again. So again, there's a pretty basic tools. I've also used Michael's Tetra Insights, especially for my, when I'm a solo researcher where I'm doing research ops and conducting research and coding and creating video clips. It's a great one-stop shop for smaller teams. And so I guess those are just some name drops from what I use, but really see what you need and then only pay for what that will be.
A couple of really critical tools in our research arsenal are DocuSign for consent forms, Calendly for scheduling, and Ribbon, which we use for sending and tracking incentives. So those are outside of the actual research experience, but are invaluable components for how we do research.
Wonderful. So I'm also seeing a lot of questions about building rapport with participants. So one is, are there any good strategies for building rapport and trust with your participants, since it may not be possible to do this in person?
I wanted to share something that we haven't yet started doing, but it's an idea I want to steal from Atlassian, which Atlassian they're doing just awesome stuff around research and research ops. And I think that they actually do most of their studies remotely. So they've been doing this for a while. Actually, another resource I was going to point out was Rosenfeld. So Rosenfeld recently had a webinar where they were talking about how they sort of get the most out of Zoom. They use the waiting room feature of Zoom to sort of have a pre-research session chat with their participants. And then that's where they go over the consent form as well, which is, sort of more the technical stuff that you have to get through. But I just love how they were talking about sort of building respect into the process and how they're trying to do that remotely. And sometimes just being creative with how we use the tools that we have at our disposal to do that. And so I love that idea, because especially when we have, when we're doing usability studies remotely, you might have a whole room full of observers, and you don't want to overwhelm your participant with all these names popping up. So using that meeting room feature, I thought was a really creative thing. And then sorry, the dog is on the squeaky toy. Can you take that toy away from her? I just wanted to say, like, the COVID context here, I think we can't lose that, right? This is an unusual situation that we're all going through. And something that we've helped our researchers with is just, first of all, acknowledging that they are going through this, but also that all our participants and our users are going through this, and we're all doing this together, instead of like going through with our research plans and communications as if it's just business as usual, right? So we've actually created some templated language that we use in our emails. We have sort of I don't want to say a script, but some talking points that researchers are using, where they're also just acknowledging what they're going through. Like I have a puppy that is chewing on a squeaky toy right now, and a 7-year-old who's supposed to be taking the toy away, right? But just practicing some grace and humor in that situation. I think there's actually a really unique opportunity to build some rapport around that. And that's working really well. And then, I think we have some additional challenges around, like, we are encouraging camera use. We also have a company policy now where we say camera use is optional because people are experiencing fatigue, right? And there's that sort of like always being on. I think actually user research is one where, like, if you're going to save your camera on time for 1 or 2 hours a day, that would be a really good one to use it on, right? Because you get that feedback. And just reassuring our researchers, reassuring all of you who are, sort of in the research world, that no one expects this to be perfect, and communicating that upfront with your stakeholders and your participants. Those are some of the things that come to mind for me.
I'll just chime in quickly. I mentioned this before, but like focusing on participant experience, if you make it a focus, you'll come up with ideas to think from that person's perspective so that it is better for them. But a couple of things that we do opt-in for participants always and ongoing. We treat our research pool like a community. We engage them with content, we engage them over email. And as I mentioned, we try to do phone screens in advance. And the person who does the phone screen will oftentimes be that second research coordinator who will help facilitate, maybe do the introduction before we start recording. So there's a little bit of relationship that can be developed in advance that can help with that.
Just a quick tip is that we've actually included in our scripts, like, we've been experiencing more bandwidth issues. It's not your fault if things happen funny. It's just a new normal. And so just join me back on this link or just call back in, no problem, and we'll take it from there. And so just kind of starting each session with understanding that things are weird right now, and they don't have to be, as everyone has been saying, they don't have to be perfect. We're just going to have a chat, and whatever happens, happens.
I love that. Thank you all for sharing. And we are at time. So I apologize that we couldn't get to all the questions in the chat. There's so many wonderful ones. And, I wish we did have more time to answer all of them. But unfortunately we are, we are there. So to wrap up, I just want to say thank you all for joining. And thank you to our panelists for such a rich discussion on remote research, a very relevant topic. I personally learned a lot. But before we end, know that this session is recorded and will be posted to the Boulder Startup Week website at some point soon. So if you know anyone who you think could benefit from, watching this, feel free to forward it to them. The link will be on the website soon. And thank you all again. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Happy researching.
Thanks everyone for coming.